this is my message to millennials about how to change the world. And I would say how to change the world properly. Of course, the question then is, well, exactly what do you mean by properly? And of course, that's the fundamental issue. So this was triggered in part by something I read recently by Jonathan Haidt. And Jonathan Haidt is the professor of ethical leadership at the NYU Stern School of Business. And he's been a very astute commentator recently on some of the political battles that have been going on in the social sciences. And Haidt recently wrote something where he claimed that universities have to decide between social justice and truth. And on the side of truth, he puts a philosopher named John Stuart Mill, an English philosopher, who said, "He who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion." And then he juxtaposes John Stuart Mill with Karl Marx, who said the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. He considers Marx the patron saint of social justice university, which is oriented around changing the world in part by overthrowing power structures and privilege. It sees political diversity as an obstacle to action. Mill, on the other hand, according to Haidt, is the patron saint of what he calls Truth U, which sees truth as a process in which flawed individuals challenge each other's biased and incomplete reasoning, and in the process all become smarter. Haidt points out that Truth University dies when it becomes intellectually uniform or politically orthodox. So I guess this video is in part my call, along with Jonathan Haidt, for young people to join Truth University. But there's a problem with that, because the university is where the truth is being sought. That's the university. But there's a problem, and that is that young people want to change the world. And it's part of what Piaget, the developmental psychologist Piaget, called the messianic stage. And there's some real utility in that, because we're social creatures. And as we construct ourselves and formulate ourselves and bring our own character into being, predicated on our biological platform, our biological being, we also simultaneously have to adjust to integrate with and negotiate with society, which sometimes needs to be changed. The structure of society has to be preserved, but it has to be updated and improved as it moves forward. So part of the problem is how to update and improve it without doing that so rapidly that you destroy everything of any value. So the problem I have with the Marxist perspective, and I've had this problem with it for a long time, is that I don't think that you should trust people whose primary goal when they're attempting to change the world for the better is to change other people. And you can tell who those people are because they're always blaming other people, and they're looking for victims. They're looking for perpetrators and victims, and then they're going off to stop the perpetrators. And I think that's wrong, because as Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, he's a great Russian writer who helped bring down the Soviet Union. He said, the line between good and evil runs down every human's heart. So the real battle, as far as I'm concerned, and I think this goes along with the tradition in which John Stuart Mill is firmly placed in, is that to overcome tyranny and malevolence and chaos and nihilism and the desire to bring everything to a halt, you have to repair the fissures and the rift that's in your own soul, basically. And that means that you have to confront the evil that lives in your own heart. And there's a statement from the New Testament that I think is very much apropos with regards to this particular idea. And this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, which is a central text in the Western tradition. I would say obviously central to Christianity, but central to everything that Western civilization has built. And so Christ says to his followers, "Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, Let me pull out the mote out of thine eye? And behold, a beam is in thine own eye. Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast the mote out of thy brother's eye." Well, I like that quote because it places the responsibility for change at every level of being on the individual. And obviously the individual interacts with society, but the idea here is that unless the individual straightens out his or her own soul, there's no possibility that the impact the individual can have on society can be anything but say harmful in proportion to the harm that's still in the soul. These are important things to know. They're vitally important things to know. But then we're faced with the conundrum that young people also want to change the world. But that's no problem, because I think you can bring you can bring Truth University together with the desire to make real change. But change has to start in the right place. So I'm going to tell you how I think you should change yourself so that you can change the world. And so that the world that you bring into being will be a better world and not a worse one. Remember, you need to know about this, that the world that the followers of Marx brought into being in the 20th century killed more than 100 million people, say in China and Russia, the Soviet Union, and in places like Cambodia and Vietnam. The world certainly changed as a consequence of Marxist doctrine, but it didn't change in a good direction. And of course, the Marxist doctrine is making itself heard in a massive way across the West again now. So, all right, so what should you do about that? Well, here's an idea. The first thing you have to do is orient yourself. Now, you probably have all watched Pinocchio, and Pinocchio is about how a marionette, someone whose strings are being pulled by forces beyond his comprehension. That's the situation of the undeveloped individual. Geppetto, who's a benevolent father, so a benevolent symbol of benevolent culture, makes a puppet, his son, and then wishes on a star. Now, a star is something that glitters up in the sky, and it's associated with the transcendent and the beyond and the divine. And if you look up in the night sky and it's very dark, you get a feeling of awe. It's because you're confronting your soul, so to speak. Your individual soul is confronting the cosmos, and you can feel a relationship between you and the totality. So looking up into the sky is like a religious experience if it's a starry sky. And to wish upon a star is to find a light that orients you like the North Star, and to pick the highest goal you can conceive of. So that's what Geppetto does. He raises his eyes above his day-to-day concerns and tries to establish a relationship with the highest of all possible values. And he has the most profound of wishes, and the most profound of wishes is that the puppet that he's created could become a genuine individual, a genuinely, fully developed human being. That's what you can wish for yourself. You can wish and aim for that in yourself. And then, you see, that's how you deal with the suffering that's attendant on life, because life is suffering, and because life is very hard, and people get sick, and they become mentally ill, and there's malevolence in the world, and there's tragedy, and so life is very, very hard. And if you're not properly oriented with regards to life, the fact that it's hard and the fact that it's full of suffering can warp and twist and bend you until you become murderous and resentful, and even go beyond murderous and resentment to wish for genocide, and even to wish for the destruction of everything. And so you have to learn how to strengthen yourself as an individual so that you can bear the burden of being without becoming corrupt. You have to decide that is what you're aiming for, is that you want to become a fully developed human being and stop being a pathetic marionette whose strings are being pulled by horrible forces behind the scenes. Anyways, if you have a relationship with someone, it's predicated on trust. And part of the reason for that is that trust is what enables us to look at each other without running away screaming. And what I mean by that is that if I trust you, then I don't have to take into account how complicated you are, because you're horribly complicated. I think chimpanzee full of snakes, that's what a human being is. And as long as you'll do what you say you'll do, then I can take you at your word, and your word simplifies you, and you can take me at my word, and my word simplifies you, and then we can act like we understand each other even though we don't. But then if that trust is betrayed, then all the snakes come forth very, very rapidly. And so all of you, I suspect, have been betrayed one way or another. And so what happens, if you're in a relationship with someone and you trust them, then you make certain assumptions about the past, and you make certain assumptions about the present, and you make certain assumptions about the future. And everything's stable, and so you're standing on solid ground. And the chaos, it's like you're standing on thin ice. The chaos is hidden. The shark beneath the waves isn't there. You're safe. You're in the lifeboat. But then if the person betrays you, like if you're in an intimate relationship and the person has an affair and you find out about it, then you think one moment you're one place, right? You're where everything is secure because you've predicated your perception of the world on the axiom of trust. And the next second, you're in a completely different place. And not only is that place different right now, the place you were years ago is different, and the place you're going to be in the future, years hence, is different. And so all of that certainty, that strange certainty that you inhabit, can collapse into incredible complexity. And you say, well, if someone betrays you, you think, well, okay, who were you? Because you weren't who I thought you were. And I thought I knew you, but I didn't know you at all. And I never knew you. And so all the things we did together, those weren't the things that I thought were happening. Something else was happening. And you were someone else. And that means I'm someone else because I thought I knew what was going on. And clearly I don't. I'm some sort of blind sucker or the victim of a psychopath or someone who's so naive that they can barely live. And I don't understand anything about human beings, and I don't understand anything about myself. And I have no idea where I am now. I thought I was at home, but I'm not. I'm in a house, and it's full of strangers, and I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow or next week or next year. It's like all of that certainty, that habitable certainty, collapses right back into the potential from which it emerged. And that's a terrifying thing. That's a journey to the underworld from a mythological perspective. And that is really something worth knowing. Because, journeys to the underworld are extraordinarily common in mythological stories. And, like the Hobbit going out to find the Smaug, the dragon, and get the gold is a journey into the underworld. And journeys to the underworld happen all the time. And modern people don't understand what the underworld is, except that we've all been there. And we go there all the time. And we go there every time the solidity and stability of the world that we've erected, at least partly through our speech, is shattered because, some sort of snake appears. That's another way of thinking about it, and it's a really good way of thinking about it because, no matter how carefully you construct the little habitable area that's around you, there's always something you didn't take into account, and there's always something that can pop up its head and do you in and make you aware of your mortality and age you for that matter, or even kill you. And that's the permanent situation of life, which is part of the reason why I think the story of Adam and Eve, for example, is archetypal. It explains the eternal situation of human beings. We're always in that situation. We're in a walled garden, or we bloody well hope we are. But there's always a snake. And then it's even worse, because if there is a snake, we're exactly the sort of creatures who are going to do nothing but go and interact with that snake the second that we can manage it. Imagine you've been married for 10 years. And then your wife tells you that she has had 3 affairs, each of them lasted 3 years, and the last one has lasted 5 years, and it's still ongoing. Or maybe you discover that. Okay, so then you might say, well, what happens then? Well, what happens is that everything you thought was wrong, right? And this is such an interesting thing, because it actually means you had the past, and you think the past is fixed, it's done with. That's why it's the past. But all of a sudden you find out that one of the things that you thought about the past, and it happens to be a very important thing, wasn't true at all. And so what that means is that whole past that you thought was what it was, wasn't what it was at all. And so it transforms itself from an actuality into potential. And most of that potential is negative. Unless you're relieved that your wife had an affair. But that's an important consideration because, you can imagine a situation where your marriage is dreadfully unhappy and you're just looking for an excuse to leave. It's possible that that revelation, even though it would be shocking, would also come with a fair bit of relief. And so the potential that manifests itself, even when it's unexpected, doesn't only necessarily manifest itself in a negative guise. It can also free you. And if your marriage was unhappy, even if you wanted to cling to it, if your marriage was unhappy and the betrayal was revealed and you're divorced and you set yourself up, in 2 years you might be in a better place than you were. It's not a pathway I'm recommending, by the way. I'm just saying that it's more complicated than it looks. That's the introduction of chaos into order, right? And the oldest story we have is something like, order is susceptible to disruption by chaos. And the fundamental demand that's made on the human being is to contend with the chaos that disrupts order. Not to live in order and not to live in chaos, but to be able to contend with the chaos that disrupts order. And so when you encourage your children, for example, what you're doing is encouraging them to become the masters of the chaos that can disrupt order, rather than denizens of order, which makes them tyrants, or denizens of chaos, which makes them nihilistic and hopeless. So you train your children, you encourage your children and yourself and your partner, if you have any sense, to be a master of emergent chaos and to be able to contend with that. And so chaos is potential, and it's this disruptive, it's the capacity of the infinite world to disrupt your finite considerations. That's another way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is it's the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And the reason that that story is set up the way it is because it's trying to represent that. There's no place that's so bounded and secure, even if it's set up by God himself, that doesn't have an agent of chaos inside it. It's exactly the same idea that the Taoists put forward with their symbolic representation. It's just portrayed in a different manner. And the question is, well, what do you do in the garden given that there's a snake in it? And the answer to that is something like, you become the master of snakes. And that's a deep idea. That's the same idea as confronting the dragon and getting the treasure. That's the same idea as going to the bottom of the ocean and rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. It's the same idea. And that's an element in the greatest of stories, and the greatest of stories is the heroic story. And the heroic story is to voluntarily confront the unknown when it manifests itself, and to gather something of value as a consequence, and to share it with the community. So agreeable people are compassionate and polite. What are disagreeable people like? They're tough-minded, they're blunt, they're competitive, and they won't do a damn thing they don't want to do. So it isn't exactly that they're aggressive, although they will push you the hell out of their way if you're in the way. They're not like volatile like you are if you're high in neuroticism. It isn't defensive aggression. It's more like predatory aggression. It's dominance behavior. And so for someone who's highly disagreeable, they look at the world as a place in which they can compete and win. And I'll tell you a story. I have a friend. I gave him my personality test, the Big 5 aspect scale that Colin DeYoung developed in my lab. And I knew he was a disagreeable guy, and by interacting with him. He's even rude to people sort of spontaneously on the street. I actually like him quite a bit. He's very, very funny. He's also very conscientious, so you can trust him, but he's disagreeable as hell. And so I gave him this test because I thought it would be funny, and he came out as the most disagreeable person in 10,000. Reasonable in compassion, about 30th percentile, but like 0.001 in politeness. So he's extraordinarily blunt, and he'll just say absolutely anything, no matter how horrible it is. And he was often brought into corporations to sort of clean them up. So if a corporation was tilting and not doing well, they'd bring him in to find out who the useless people were and fire them. And I talked to him about that because I've had the opportunity to have to not have graduate students in my lab, for example, that weren't performing well. And I find it very, very difficult to, dress someone down, and certainly difficult to fire them. I just hate it because I'm actually quite an agreeable person, much to my chagrin. And I asked him about that, and I said, well, what do? You have to fire people all the time. How do you handle that? He says, handle it? I enjoy it. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting that someone would have that response. I said, well, what do you mean you enjoy it? He said, look, I go into these companies and I analyze the performance of groups of people, right? And in those groups, there are people who are really striving, really trying hard and working themselves really hard and being productive. And then there's these people that are just doing nothing. They're completely in the way. They don't carry their weight at all. They take advantage every chance they get. And they're always whining about why they can't work. It's like, I find out who they are, I call them into my office, and I tell them exactly what they've been doing. It's like, hit the road, buddy. You've had your run of it. And I thought, oh yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, I can tell you, I've had situations in my lab where I had underperforming graduate students. And one of the things that was really awful about that was that it was really hard on the high-performing graduate students, because they felt that even being in the same category as the people who weren't working hard and pulling their weight devalued what they were doing, and that's exactly right. And so this is also why there's a conscientiousness trait and an agreeableness trait. Because conscientious people judge you on your accomplishments, right? They don't give a damn about your feelings, not a bit. It's like, are you doing the work or not? Whereas agreeable people think, well, your mother's sick, and you've got a bunch of family problems, and we all have to take care of each other, and it's no wonder that you're having a rough time. And you can't say that one of those attitudes is correct and the other isn't correct. You can't say that. There wouldn't be those two dimensions if there wasn't something correct about both of them. But you can certainly point out that often they conflict, and so the demand for inclusiveness and unity and care, and the demand for high-level performance in a hierarchical structure, they're very different orientations in the world. And so It's complicated for people who are agreeable and conscientious. And actually, I think often that large corporations and large institutions of any sort run on the unheralded labor of people who are high in agreeableness and high in conscientiousness, and they're disproportionately women. And my experience in large institutions has been that if you want to hire someone to exploit appropriately, no, not appropriately, if you want to hire someone to exploit productively, you hire middle-aged women who are hyper-conscientious and who are agreeable, because they'll do everything. They won't take credit for it, and they won't complain. And that's nasty, and I think that happens all the time. And so one of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. And I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants. And so that just doesn't work so well in that actual world. And one of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think that you think are nasty and harsh. And they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. And you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. And if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you're also maybe loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term. Because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And, if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. And so partly what you do with agreeable people is you get them to figure out, and they have a hard time with this too. If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want, and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all.